I want you to feel that complicatedness. I do want you to see this weird corporate product that was a series of compromises and spins, and how do we take this idea and make it into something we can actually do, and how do we do this, and how do we get this company to give us $30 million and all these things. But also to see like it was just a bunch of people on the ground doing their job, and while they were doing it, they did some incredible things.
That is Kevin Perjurer from Defunctland, who is here to talk about his new film, Journey to EPCOT Center, A Symphonic History. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, thanks for joining me here on episode 215 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. It was really cool to get the chance to talk with my guest today, Kevin Perjurer, who has created so many cool videos at Defunctland on YouTube, including his feature-length documentaries on FastPass and the Disney Channel theme, plus so many interesting looks at history of pop culture, including a lot of Disney content, but also TV. I'm going to stay pretty brief here. I just want to say that if you have not checked out Journey to EPCOT Center, A Symphonic History, I highly recommend it, regardless of what you've heard about it. It's a very different approach, like Kevin and I talk about. You don't have to be, like me, someone who just adores early EPCOT Center to be interested. I actually think there's a way where you could be someone who, like Kevin, visited the parks more recently and now is curious about it, or also has mixed feelings. And the approach Kevin takes, I think, allows for a lot of different views on EPCOT Center. Go to Defunctland's YouTube channel, watch the movie. Comeback will be here. But regardless, it was awesome to spend an hour with Kevin talking about his film. So let's do this. Here is Kevin Perjurer. Kevin, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, definitely. I really enjoyed the new documentary, which included a lot of things I didn't know, and also just such an interesting way to look at it. So I know you've done videos in the past. You had Walt's Epcot, which I know you kind of present as Act 1 of this in the film. But I'm curious what interested you about really diving into the development of Epcot Center. Like, why was that a topic that you thought was cool for a documentary?
Yeah, I mean, it's been in the works for a while. Season 3 of Defunctland, I broke episodes into seasons for a while, and I still do. I've been working on this film for so long, as this is kind of the mid stopping point of this journey. And I think it might be towards the end of it now. I'm trying to kind of calculate, what the story is after doing it. But the first 13 episodes of this season, this collection of videos, a lot of them were about World's Fairs. A lot of them about or early amusement parks, Tomorrowland 1955. I did something on Tomorrowland 1967 with Adventure Through Inner Space. And if you watch those in order, it kind of tracks the development of Walt Disney's life, leading to his idea of Epcot the city. And all of those videos are narrated, which is my typical style. I knew that I really wanted to complete that journey from before Walt Disney's birth with the World's Fairs through Walt Disney's life with Epcot, and then eventually with the opening of EPCOT Center. And after spending some time looking at the materials of what that story is, it was so visual and abstract as a concept for so long, EPCOT Center, in this middle period between Walt City, which is very in the early stages of development when he dies, and EPCOT Center as it opens. Everything that happened in between was very fascinating to me. And I thought the evolution of it was very interesting. And that's what I found just so interesting, was this kind of period that usually gets brushed over in most stories as it was a city, and then they made it into a permanent World's Fair or a theme park. And a lot happened in between, a lot more steps and a lot more key moments that occurred in order for that development to take place. And that's what I really wanted to to journey to go through.
Yeah, and that really stands out to me is just watching it, just remembering. I mean, I wasn't alive in the 70s, but how daring it was of a concept for EPCOT Center, especially Disney was not as large a company as they are now. I mean, was part of the goal too, were you looking to kind of also tell that history that, again, like you said, sometimes gets glossed over, but also what jumps out at me in the documentary is just kind of, I don't know if I'd say crazy, but a little bit insane how them doing what they decided to do and spend $1 billion in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, I think the documentary doesn't say, because this as it's not narrated by me, which is
Right.
very kind of the premise creatively, but it showcase what it chooses to showcase says a few things, and I think it's one of the more objective works where I just try to show what happened. But what I choose to show, my goal first and foremost was to show as I mentioned, the creative molding of an idea, the iterative process. But more than that, I just wanted to show, desperation, momentum, history, technology, how all of that played into this specific idea coming to fruition. And this story being such a and then this park being such a park that opened due to what feels like a huge thrust, and kind of a dark thrust, considering it was the death of Walt Disney that pushed it forward. What was that I found fascinating that I really just wanted to showcase was how so many influences, so many ideas, technology, sounds, obviously are a huge part of the documentary, instruments, music, culture, history, how it all kind of came together to push this idea into the public. Because as I mentioned, there's a few common narratives about EPCOT Center that I really wanted to not dispel, because I don't come out and mention those narratives. I just present the narrative that I think is the most true. And I wanted to show that through the series of dominoes. And so I think the biggest thing with EPCOT Center as it opened on October 1st of 1982 is that it just, to the public, and you see this towards the end of the film, it is what it is. And it opened as something that felt cohesive in idea, but was also very foreign to the mind. And the closest thing you could describe it as is a World's Fair. But it's also not a World's Fair, if you know what World's Fairs are. It's also not that at the same time. So it's a very odd thing. And really what I wanted the film to do was, by the end of this progression of events, for you to understand exactly why Epcot is the way that it is. More than just it was a city and it was a theme park. And kind of that this company, that these people inside of it, how much of an obligation it was, how much of an accomplishment, of course, in scale, and also how much of kind of an obligation, as I mentioned, and the compromises that had to be made in order to make it. And all that kind of is it's a big kind of swirl of ideas, which is very different for something that I, especially me, have done, which is I usually come out and say these things with words in English. And this one
Right.
is very much me trying to present them and show you them and allow you to kind of have that, because that's very similar to what real life is, which is a swirling of culture and music and history and ethics and morals and capitalism and art and all these things. And really this is just, you kind of get to see the dominoes just hit each other down the 16 years that the film covers.
I want to dig a little more into that format, because I think about, I mean, you've done so many, but some of your big recent films like Fast Pass and then the Disney Channel theme, where I admit I didn't know as much about the Disney Channel theme and all that growing up. So that your narration kind of led me along that path. But I'm curious, I'm approaching Epcot Center as somebody who knows a lot, not everything that you included, but a good amount. But did you ever consider, I'm curious, when you decided, okay, this is where I'm going to do things differently. Did you ever consider kind of doing your narration and then realized it didn't really work? I mean, what made you decide to really focus on this kind of more experimental approach, which I think worked really well?
Well, I appreciate that. I think it's definitely different. I've been working on this for probably 4 years from concept. The first iteration of the first song was delivered in October of 2020. So over 3 years of actual production. But, I came up with the idea earlier. Yeah, I don't remember what it exactly was. It was a few things. I can tell you there was a few things that really I wanted to capture, and I think martinsvids.net is the one that I want to just throw out as the first spark of doing
Oh
something
yeah.
without narration. If you're familiar with Martin's work, as many people that really enjoy theme park history are, not just archival work, but the way that those videos exist without narration. I watched them and I just felt they were able to accomplish something that my narration got in the way of.
I've talked to Martin, and I think that is a good comp, especially with some of the like laser videos you put together, or images, the way he kind of presents maps and structures and everything else. As you know, as you're looking at that as an inspiration, then you went on and created, like you mentioned, the music. It's such an important part of it. How did that music come together? Because I feel like, especially watching it a second time when I watched it, the music really stood out to me as kind of driving the story. And I'm curious about the development of that and how that score ended up playing an important role. An original score, not Epcot music, an original score that made it come together.
Yeah, the thing that I kept saying with my composer Jamie was it's all feeling and no stealing was my rhyme, because there's no motifs from Epcot used in the score, and I think that would have been a much easier, maybe quicker approach was, well, let's do our version of It's Fun to Be Free from World of Motion, or our version of Universe of Energy's theme song, and it's a more dramatic one or it's a more upbeat one, but it's that theme. And partly because of just copyright and wanting to create something that isn't as original as possible. Obviously it's the platforms on YouTube, we're releasing it for free, and we're utilizing work in a copyrighted work in a transformative way with imagery. But at the same time, at every point that I could choose, well, I could show this with something that's copyrighted, or I could show it doing something that is my own. I always try to choose my own to make that as original as possible. At the same time, wanting to invoke that feeling that Epcot Center's music did. I think the reason for the music was, again, partly Martin's vids, partly Fantasia being another inspiration for format, not as much tone, and just Epcot Center, the park itself, is such a cinematic park. When you walked in those gates, it was unlike anything that it was ever done and ever has been done, where the motifs of the attractions are playing as you enter the ticket booth, and you don't even know what those motifs are yet because you haven't experienced those themes. But as you go throughout your day of the park, you as you walk in, you hear a synth version or a trumpet version of It's Fun to Be Free, but you don't even know that song yet. But by the time you ride World of Motion, when you exit the park, that same music plays itself back in a totally different way. And so that was part of the inspiration, is that Epcot itself has this original music. It is not relying on, in the same way that Disneyland, Magic Kingdom, many of the castle parks, if you're in Frontierland, you're hearing folk music that existed, or you're hearing just a banjo song, or if you're in Fantasyland, of course, they're drawing upon the Disney classics. Epcot's music, a lot of it, whether it was George Wilkins or Randy Bright or these composers, Robert Moline, that created this music for these attractions, it created such a unique orchestral park, and I wanted to do that justice as well, which was that was the original inspiration for the music, and it changed. The original intention of the film changed drastically. The original film, as conceived 4 years ago, was that after the tables got pushed together and Epcot Center was made, World Showcase and Future World was combined, we would go pavilion by pavilion and look at the development of each pavilion. We were writing music for like 2 years for an idea that did not happen. So we would do, after the tables got combined, we do a round trip around Epcot where we'd start at the land, and then we do 2.5 minutes on the land. And then we would do Universe of Energy, and that's 3 minutes of just Universe of Energy. And as I created the first 15 minutes of the film, I realized that this is avant-garde enough for YouTube, and just in general being a documentary that doesn't rely on narration or talking head interviews. And it was avant-garde enough, and one of the things that was making it accessible to the people that I was showing it to, and just to me as a creator, was its linear nature. And so we repurposed some of the songs from that original idea, and I can point them out at some point, but that original idea where it would pavilion by pavilion, I then had all these songs that were made for pavilions, and I had to say, okay, well, what am I going to use the song for? And then I had to kind of remap out the film, because also that other version, it just did become a tribute to Epcot. And the tribute nature of this film is just kind of already part of it just by its very nature.
Right.
And I really wanted there to also be a different reading where you could look at this as kind of a not as much of a, oh, this person creating this documentary, he just loves Epcot and that's the end of the story, but more as though it's like, wow, this is complicated in how I feel as an audience member. And that was also just trying to further that. So yeah, so like I said, a lot of the music was made for a concept that I personally think would have been a lesser concept, but there was a point where I had to kind of scramble to repurpose like 3 or 4 of the tracks that we'd written for that less linear idea.
That's interesting because, yeah, I think about watching the film, like the World of Motion part or the land or spaceship part. There were a few parts where it did seem like it was, wow, this is an attraction and we're getting it. And I love those. I thought it was really cool the way those came together. But now hearing that, and I'm not sure those are the ones you did, I'm just saying that now hearing kind of the original kind of backstory of it, that makes more sense of kind of how they fit in there. And especially World of Motion fits because, of course, that was the big GM being the first big sponsor and that whole story, which makes sense that you focus so much on that one too. But it's interesting how it might have started out as something else. Did some of those start out like that ended up in the film? Was that portions of what you just described?
Yeah, I mean, all the ones you mentioned were written for that original idea. So the first half of the film, those songs were written for what it is because that the first half was always that. The second half, World of Motion, we was halfway through writing that song that I was like thinking, okay, we got to change this. We have to make it linear. We have to make it a little bit more, like a domino effect, all those things that I mentioned earlier. And so World of Motion just made the most sense to have it be a story beat because that was another thing was this needs conflict. It can be a fun, I have to make sure this doesn't turn into a screensaver. Not that there's anything wrong with that because I hope that
Yeah.
some people use it as a screensaver because that'd be fun too. As a second monitor, put it on while you work. It's kind of chill. And that's a purpose that I love for it to have. But I also need everything to have a story beat. And so the land is probably the most obvious, where that would have been an exploration of the development of the land pavilion. But now that song that's called Seeds of Progress on the album, that is very folk song esque, similar to the land's music, now exists as the ground clearing of Epcot in the film, which was composed of dozens of satellite imagery that allows you to kind of see the footprint of Epcot before it was built. And so that is a moment where I had to say at one point, okay, throw out this idea. You now have a song that sounds like it's about the land. It sounds like it's nature, folk. Where is this in the story? And then trying to place that and kind of making it work a bit more. Another example being the construction song was for Horizons. And that was one where I just Horizons is probably my favorite music. And that was just a complete mistake on my part because I just got so obsessed with the Horizons music that song ended up being 5.5 minutes long. And I was like, well, Horizons doesn't even open with the park. Our story ends before they develop most of this attraction. And so that was also a big flag for me to be like, maybe we need to change this around. And luckily, because Horizons kind of sounds, each song in Epcot has its own genre almost. And Horizons, the GE Pavilion, is that corporate, you think, that the corporate futuristic, not as much synth, some synth, but kind of that employee training video energy almost of the 80s. And so I was like, well, that's perfect for construction. We can repurpose that one too, and stuff like that. So yeah, it was a bit of some rewriting there to make that concept work.
That makes a lot of sense. And I probably wouldn't have noticed that because, like you said, it does fit with some of the other ways they were used. Well, I want to ask you about, you did some recreations where you didn't show faces, but you kind of would show bodies or, in silhouette or something of people. You have people playing the voices of Marty Sklar and Don Tatum and others. You mentioned the conflict, which I know was part of it on a few of those, but what interests you of kind of doing it that way where you're identifying the people in a way more by what they said and did rather than trying to, actually depict an actor playing the character in a way.
Yeah, and well, I think part of it is that I did not want to draw people out of the film, because I think that in some documentaries you have these recreations where you just see this actor and it's just, oh, that's not the person that's also in the
Right.
archival photos. This being people that were that have existed more recently, it's even more difficult. This is a story happening in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. So it's, we're 40 years out, 50 years out from a lot of this. So I didn't want it to come across as you're looking at actors, and specifically with Marty Sklar and John Hench being kind of how you see the film through. You see at least the emotional the emotions from the music are kind of the emotions that anybody at the top brass would be experiencing at the time. But it's specifically, I did not want to just take people out. And Marty Sklar and John Hench are depicted, and you can see their hands, you can see the back of their heads, I think once or twice, but they do not have voice actors, because I thought that would be even more difficult, because these people have been doing interviews recently, in the past 10 years. Marty Sklar passed away just 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, and John Hench, I think, passed away in the mid 2000s. And so, they have been talking about the subject more recently, so it felt less necessary to have their words be recreated by an actor, not only because I think, fans and people that are familiar with this recognize the voice already, but also because, it's just, I have a few clips of Marty Sklar talking about this. So I'm just going to put those in every now and then to give you their perspective. And then the only two people that are actually depicted through voice acting are Card Walker and Don Tatum. And then there's a lot of other voice actors that play generic roles: announcers, news people, narrators. And the reason for that was just because we have so much of this film, so much of the documentary, they're reading copy that Disney produced about the project, and I needed a voice to read those, and it just made the most sense. They're the top brass, they're very public figures, they're very in the case of Don Tatum and Card Walker, there really isn't that much footage of them, and there's definitely not that much audio of them, which is odd because of the CEOs of Disney. But you have to go out of your way to find footage of Don Tatum speaking, and so everything, it wasn't to recreate stuff like that. It wasn't a decision of, well, am I going to use the audio of Don Tatum saying this, or am I going to use a voice actor to do it? It was just, there is no audio. So we need to, the description of, like in the laser segment, is a long period where you hear Don Tatum and Card Walker reading the copy of that idea, that version of EPCOT, the first non-city EPCOT. And part of the difficulty is visualizing it, which is a whole nother part of it. But as far as portrayals go, really, I just didn't want it to pull people out, and I didn't want to disrespect the people involved. And I just try to do it the most subtle way and only when necessary, and all that stuff. Trying to make it, I don't know if classy is the right word. Just trying to do what's necessary to promote the story, to make the story go forward, to place people in the time, and then pulling them out of that, and then putting them in a more abstract, less people acting live action recreation, and more of an abstract recreation of sequences. That was the intention.
Right. Yeah. And I misspoke, actually, because, Marty Sklar, we hear his voice, but most of it we'll see him like the Leonard Maltin interview and a few other things where, like you said, I don't think I've ever heard Don Tatum's voice on anything. The only reason I know Card Walker is mostly from the EPCOT dedication, or that speech in the beginning. That's one of the few times I've seen him. So those do make a lot of sense to use because, like you said, they were leading the company, and again, not... Yeah, it's weird. I guess there aren't that many interviews that you see, period, with them. It's different era and everything else,
Yeah, and you'll see some with Card Walker, especially after EPCOT opens, but this period specifically in the 70s, very little archival audio interviews. I really wanted Ron Schneider, who was the original Dreamfinder walk-around at EPCOT Center, to portray Card Walker, partly because Ron has such a great voice and has such a classic sounding voice, and also just because it was kind of this lineage concept of just, I am going to be recreating Card Walker, and we're not going, instead of getting someone to do an exact impression to try to fake it, do more of a full circle portrayal. And Ron was so was so great to work with. I've spoken with him in the past on a podcast, and when I reached out, he said yes, and it was such a great experience. And so I was also really excited to have that, and with the film, it's trying to pay homage, tribute, and then also kind of showcase some of the flaws and faults in this concept as well. So it's a weird line to try to walk, especially without me being able to jump in and say that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. Ron Schneider played Walt Disney's head.
Oh yeah, yeah. And so
he could do the voice of Walt Disney.
I said, yeah, he if he played Walt Disney, then I think he'll have no problem playing Card Walker.
Yeah. So when you're developing this documentary, you talked about already the shift that you did, but was it challenging at all to narrow the focus? Because I feel like, I know you're covering a long period of time that doesn't get mentioned much, so a lot of what you're doing is going to be new to a lot of people. But like you said, it's easy to kind of get into let's talk about really what EPCOT Center was versus the path. So, I mean, how much time did you spend kind of really boiling it down to, here are the few things I want to really focus on for this?
Yeah, I mean, boiling down is a great way to describe it. I mean, it is trying to create, it is Journey to EPCOT Center, and it is about EPCOT Center, the park, not to do the literary trope of a character in this book is New York City, or a character in this film is New York City, but the main character of the film is EPCOT. The concept and the character arc of the film is EPCOT. I mean, it's not that subtle in the film, but it does go through the biggest change. And EPCOT Center, the park. And so to answer your question, it was a lot of my work, and I think this is the hardest thing if you've seen work where I'm narrating, where there's different kinds of depth. I feel especially in documentary space, there's statistical depth, which is a lot of numbers, a lot of analytics, a lot of, this is how many acres it is, this is how long the ride track is, this is how fast a ride will go. And I think a lot of people are really interested in that, and I'm one of them. I think that's a fascinating thing. And there's also anecdotal depth, which is more like, something happened this day on October 7th, 1981, during the construction of EPCOT. A crane fell and they had to redo this. And that's, very on the ground, anecdotal, a few people involved. It's a little story, and that can provide a feeling of depth. And with this film, if I were to do that, either one of those, and there's moments with both, right? There's the construction segment that relies on the 1981 update, which has a lot of statistical depth as far as like budgets and timeline and stuff like that. And then there's anecdotal depth, and in little vignettes, there's that story that is, of all places, in a auction book of Raleigh Crump's life, where him and John Hench get into a fight, which is anecdotal depth, right? That's not a huge overhead, but those two things are included in the film because I felt it was important to see those. But the biggest thing that with this film that I really wanted to do, which is different and weird a little bit, but it's visceral depth, which is I wanted to transport people to a place, to a time, and especially with EPCOT itself, to these EPCOTs that never came to be, because you get to tour 3 or 4 different EPCOTs that did not come to be. And you get to fly through them, or you get to see, depictions of them. And, that was something that I really wanted to showcase, because this film could have easily, if I talked about every single story that it happened in the development of EPCOT, it would be 30, 60, it would be 16 years long, because that's how long history happened.
Right.
And maybe even longer, because multiple stories are occurring at the same time. I mean, thousands and thousands of people worked on this project. My thing for me was, as tempting as it is, and as much as a fan of rides, to go into each ride, to tell you about each scene, to tell you about this effect in Universe of Energy, or this scene in Journey into Imagination, or all those things that I talk about in other videos and I wanted to talk about. The most important thing that I really wanted to focus on was the scope of the park, the layout of the park, the sponsorships, not the sponsorships as far as each individual attraction, but the sponsorship lineups, which is the thing that's going to make the park happen, and the courting of those sponsorships. And so that was kind of what I wanted to look at the most. It's like, rather than walking around in the Epcot that opened and getting to go to each little corner and finding each little detail and every little speck of dust. It's more, you are in one of the scenes, you literally are, but throughout the film you are looking above this project just get molded and reshaped and then refired and ripped apart and then changed again, and just to see it just. And that was really the only way that I think I could have done it in an hour and 9, again, without talking.
And you mentioned the sponsorship too, which, I mean, on the surface, you could say, oh, that might not be that exciting to watch Disney go pitch a bunch of corporations and countries, which I know was so important to Epcot. But the way you present, especially with the countries where you have kind of that whole scene where it's kind of in silhouette, and the various ways you do it, where you have them flying out to all these countries and then the pens getting pulled away. I'm curious to, for you, I mean, about focusing on the sponsorship, because I know how important that is, like, why that was important to you, but also then you finding a way to present that in something that was visually interesting, which I'm sure was something you spent some time on.
Yeah, I mean, the sponsorships are the biggest conflict of the film, especially during Act Two, which, in screenplay, or because, and the film is separated into 3 acts, just to talk about it a little easier. But and I don't come out again and say this, and it's not that obvious, but Act 1 is city to EPCOT Center. Act 2 is EPCOT Center to groundbreaking, and then Act 3 is groundbreaking to opening. And especially in Act 2, where you're supposed to have, the conflict, the back and forth, the fun and games of the premise, the promise of the premise, in your traditional 3-act structure, the sponsorships were the most antagonistic force, not just literally in trying to get them as sponsors, but also creatively in the compromises that needed to be made. And I think that showcase is what Epcot is, because this project is a sponsorship project, and even Walt City, that was going to be a big part of it. And I think the alternate history where Epcot the city would have gone forward with these sponsorships would have taken some similar approach. In the case of the Future World sponsorships, you see what's going on, and I try to allude to it a few other times subtly throughout the film, of why is Exxon here? Because today we see Exxon and we know a lot more about Exxon. But back then, what's going on in the 70s with Exxon? And you're like, well, they're trying out these different forms of power. We obviously know about the oil crisis. Energy is on everybody's minds in the 70s. So that is one that is immediate. And then just other little things of just to see how excited people are about the phone. And AT&T and the Bell system, that's a really important thing of not just, well, we need money to make this project happen, but also just why. And just to see some of the commercials of some people, just, there's a little clip that I love of somebody getting a phone for Christmas, which is just so funny. But like back then, people were blown away by the accessibility and the amount of phones they could have and stuff like that. And so that places you in there. As far as Future World go, that's like a placement of you, the viewer, in that history. And you can kind of see what people back then were seeing, their fear of nuclear power, their fear of no oil, the need for energy being something that is not sustainable. Not as many people were concerned about it back then, but it was more of accessible, especially in terms of America. And then on the World Showcase side, there's little subtle hints to that too, if you just want to follow the energy thread of, they're going to Saudi Arabia, and you can see in the background of the silhouette of the Saudi Arabia scene when they're trying to court Saudi Arabia to sponsor Epcot because they showed interest. You can see a city developing and an oil rig in the background. And so that's what's happening in that country at this time. And in the little vignette where you see Margaret Thatcher and the rise of that right wing, the conservative politics movement in Britain. And okay, well, that's happening there. And then you go around the world, and then you do the World Showcase sponsors. And our goal was kind of to show what was going on in each country. Some of them are easier than others because, you go to Germany in the late 70s, it's not called Germany, it's West Germany or East Germany. And just things like that. Like, you can't just evoke the modern understanding of what's going on in the world, because when we were depicting those things, it was kind of how do we best showcase that, and also trying to stay true to history. Like a lot of this was documented, and I talk about it in the historical companion of Jack Lindquist's book and other books mention, and there's photos of like John. There is a photo that's depicted almost in silhouette of, I think it was John Hench. I know it's John Hench and maybe Dick Nunes getting on a plane to go pitch the sponsorships again. This is something that actually happened. There's just not a lot of photos or video of it. And to kind of show like this is the world, this is world politics, but at the same time it's like this is a theme park. It's just a lot of ideas. And the idea of depicting it with the world especially, it was, okay, we're going to be depicting a lot of cultures and a lot of different countries. And I really wanted to create a consistency that still allowed for uniqueness. And so that was the idea of, okay, every country we depict visually, they have a table with the model on it, but the table's different every time. It's like more the table resembles the architecture of the country you're in. It has a background, a foreground, one world leader that they did or could have met with, stuff like that. Trying to develop some sort of consistency while allowing room for uniqueness between the countries, because I didn't want it to look like we were focusing more on one country or one on the other, both to represent it visually, but also because they were genuinely just interested in any country, as depicted by the 8 nations interested in World Showcase, and that list during the newspaper scene of like, oh my gosh, the World Showcase where it is just the Soviet Union and Saudi Arabia and none of the food festival type countries that would come to mind if you're somebody in the United States. What do you want out of a world market? I want a baguette, stuff like that. But it is
Right.
Who's going to say yes to this, and a lot of those people, a lot of those countries, the ones that were most likely to say yes are dictatorships or kingdoms where you didn't need to convince a Congress, you need to convince one person. It's a very complicated history, and I think that the goal was to kind of showcase that complexity and that conflict, and trying not to make it look too much of an assimilation of every culture, but also depicting it similarly enough to where we weren't biased towards one or the other. So it was kind of I know that was a lot. Sorry to ramble about it.
No, that was great. I think you summed it up really well, and it really provided good background on why you did it that way, which makes a lot of sense. And I was 6 years old when EPCOT Center opened, so like the Future World side, I feel like I remember how amazing it was to see kind of these new phones and everything like you mentioned. But again, the world politics side, I, as a kid, would probably a lot of that would not have known. But it's a good reminder that we can look at it and like you said, with energy, be like, I don't understand universe of energy or anything else, but it makes more sense to know the background for that. But you also referenced like having photos of Dick Nunes and John Hench and things like that. I was impressed because I've seen a lot of, I've watched a lot of documentaries about Epcot and Disney and background, but there was still a lot of concept art and also footage that I don't think I had seen before. So I'm curious kind of when you're putting that together and able to pull various footage. I mean, there were some like the souvenir videos and the Dream called Walt Disney World, I think, that are very familiar that I remember, but I know there's a lot that I hadn't seen. So I'm curious, what were some of your kind of key resources or key films that really helped you out?
Yeah, well, A Dream Calls is the name of our concept album, and it's a slight play on A Dream Called Epcot, which was the 81 film. And there's also A Dream Called Walt Disney World, I believe, which is the Magic Kingdom version of that. It was the Magic Kingdom version of the souvenir guide for Epcot. You'd have to point out exactly which one. It came from a lot of different sources and a lot of annual reports and a lot of documents and scans that have recently been put out by some great archivists. DisneyDocs.net was invaluable to this video specifically. If you've ever been to that website, incredible. A lot of great archivists have contributed to making this possible, whether they're just uploading something that they found on a VHS tape or specifically looking for Disney stuff. But I would say the biggest development that made this possible, even since starting production on this, was Disney Docs. Maybe not as much as the visual stuff, but I mean, the information about this period of Epcot history is just, that has been a game changer. I don't think the story could have been told, at least by someone outside of having those materials, without places like DisneyDocs.net.
Oh yeah, that's an amazing resource just for so much old information, like you said, like things like manuals and or reports and things that might seem a little dry, but can give you. I remember seeing one thing that was just like what capacity they expected on Magic Kingdom rides on
Yeah.
there, and it was like so high, and I was like, really? That's what it is?
Yeah.
But things like that, which they're hidden in there, but if you really know where to look, can be super cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, one other montage I want to ask you about quickly, but is where you show the development of Figment and then also include like the robot butler and Smart One and all of that. And I'm curious to know a little bit about that because to me, it felt like it was kind of spotlighting the character side, which a lot of people look at old Epcot Center as being this really dry, boring place, but I felt like it had some fun and character to it. So I'm curious if that was kind of a little bit of that was trying to kind of hint at that without, again, as the narrator saying it was. I'd love to know a little bit about that quick montage you gave in.
Yeah, that was gonna. There was two songs I was gonna cut from the film. And I only cut one of them. And that was that we had a kitchen cabaret song that we made. Which we're gonna release on one of the downloads that we're doing. Another song that we were considering cutting was Creativity on Parade, which is the song of that sequence that you're mentioning, which is the Journey to Imagination-esque song. And really I thought, oh well, let's cut this sequence because I think I can tell the story without it. And then I made a mock-up of it and put it in there and watched the full thing. And I said, this is invaluable. This is the most necessary thing because it is kind of a sequel to an earlier cut or an earlier sequence, which is the Mystic Visions, the Future World trailer sequence, which is the multiplane that I did, where we separated the concept art of the 1977 version of Epcot Center, and that one, which we got a narrator to do this very dark Future World voice, was a very dark Epcot Center, a more dramatic Epcot Center, and Epcot Center was criticized by many as being, as you said, too educational, too dry, too information, not enough fun. But when you see kind of that late stage 80, 81 rush to make this concept a bit more Disney and also answer the sponsorships and their needs, that's what that depicted. And I really thought that was important just to see stuff like Kraft coming in and saying, oh, we want to make food fun. The original Blueprints of Nature, the Land Pavilion, the Tony Baxter, the original was much more, more adventurous. And it had a hot air balloon ride. And I don't think it was dry. It was just more grand. And then you see the seas with like Poseidon and more of the seas are a dramatic thing. And that last ditch, people are going to expect this to be Disney and the sponsors want this to be Disney. So let's add those characters in and let's create character. Let's not bring in Mickey yet, but let's add these characters to make this more of what people's expectations are, which I think is a very necessary thing for the story to understand the introduction of things like General Electric, to understand the addition of these of Kodak, of these sponsorships, of these characters. But it's also just a big part of any iterative creative process. It is that last ditch. Oh, I need to make this accessible. I've been iterating for so long. I need to make this reach audiences. And I think that's kind of what that sequence showed.
The good point, too, about them trying to, at near the very end, bring in more Disney in a way, like Disney-esque fanciful type characters, which, was important. I mean, I loved Kitchen Cabaret as a kid. I mean, I don't know how much I learned about nutrition, but I thought it was really fun.
Yeah.
And the robot butler always stood out from Horizons. And then, of course, Figment. I mean, the original Figment, I mean, come on, with Dreamfinder, it was something totally cool. Well, I haven't really asked you about, which I'm sure you have an interest in, but your personal experience with Epcot Center or what you enjoyed about it or visiting it. I'd love to know a little bit, just because obviously watching this, as someone who went a lot as a kid in the 80s and early 90s, I kind of connected and like, oh, this is somebody who personally really likes the park. But what was kind of your personal experience either growing up or visiting that got you so into it?
Well, my experience came completely after the fact, and I think that is reflected a bit in the film. I didn't visit Walt Disney World until the early 2000s, and I had visited Disneyland growing up. I think in the whole Epcot, what your idea of Epcot is is dependent on when you went, and also what your interest is. I think for me, Epcot was something that what just had is a thing that existed, not something that was built and opened. And it was sort of, when you thought of Walt Disney World, I grew up in Kansas City. When you thought of Walt Disney World, you of course first thought of the castle, but then you also thought of that big golf ball. When growing up as a kid, you're like, oh, it has the big golf ball. Finally getting to go there was something where I don't think I connected with it immediately. As I grew up, I think I just came to appreciate the scale and the weirdness of it.
Yes.
And I think that is true for a lot of Epcot fans, but I don't feel that is how it is maybe in online circles or in fan circles, how it is described. I think there is a certain section of Epcot fans that think Epcot Center was perfect, or that it was great, or that it was exactly what the world needed. And if they would have, the film does not directly rebuke that idea. And and that was one thing I wanted it to allow multiple readings of what it is. But I think what the film says, if anything, especially towards the end, is that it's big and weird, and it allows you to, I gave you my own experience of this as it, I came at it from the perspective of it being an institution, being something that had existed, and this giant thing that almost is just as part of Walt Disney World as Walt Disney's world is part of America, as America is part of the world. All these things that in the grand scheme of history are very new. If you look at even, human history, especially, all these new ideas that just feel like institutions. But the film, I think, doesn't tell you how to feel about it. I think there is, and I hope there is, and I allowed for and nodded at a reading that is just, this is weird. This is just a weird thing. Not even that it's great, or that it's the best version of it, or that it's a good idea in the first place. Just that it's weird, that a lot of people worked on it, and that it is huge. And I think it is an accomplishment in many. The original Epcot Center is an accomplishment in many ways that are inarguable as far as engineering, as far as just the actual building of it itself, what they were able to do. But as far as a creative product, it's as interpretable as any creative product. It's as interpretable as the video itself. It is what you get out of it, and kind of what you put into it as well. And yeah, so that, I think that, does that kind of answer the question? I think.
Oh yeah.
I think that's kind of my perspective, as it just being the thing that I wanted to do the most was give a explanation as to why Epcot Center existed. Not just for me as somebody that's been going to Walt Disney World for 2 decades now, although, there was a decade apart from my couple of my visits, but for people that only know it as the place where you go to drink around the world, and they only engage with it as this kind of, the World Showcase, and there's a few rides, and then you go to a different park or something, but just stop and like, why is this here? I don't think that's a question that people ask themselves a lot. And I don't think it's a question that is adequately answered by, well, Walt Disney was a dreamer and a doer, and here it is. Because that's obviously not what happened. And it's a lot more happened in between that.
Yeah, I think the weirdness is now kind of me, I still loved Epcot Center growing up. I think if somehow magically those pavilions were there would be parts of it that I still love, and the parts of it that I'm like, oh, this isn't what I remember. But the weirdness, I think, really, I still look at some of the things they created. I mean, there's things in all the parks that way, the Magic Kingdom more early on, but especially in Epcot, just because of the timing where I really connect with, I'm like, I can't believe they created that. Like, they had all the choices and they chose that. And so, yeah, like you said, it's because I went then, as anywhere you go when you're like so impressionable, 8, 10, 12, whatever, is going to always be like, oh, it's so amazing. But I know as an adult that parts of it were amazing and parts of it, probably could have changed. But I wonder, too, if that weirdness is also why, because they went so big and so strange and so odd, is why Disney cannot figure out what to do with the park now. And I'm not saying everything they've done has been bad or good or anything. I'm just wondering, do you think this is why, kind of having dug in, why Disney, it seems like their messaging just is all over the map, because they do good things and bad things, but they can't figure out what to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting to read. I've read a few. I've tried to allow the film to exist without reading every response, but a common response is like, "Wow, it's so sad that Epcot is what it is now." And as much as I'm quick to criticize or quick to point out the faults of modern Disney, I also, with this film especially, I just wanted to come at it from an objective kind of put you there. But if you did the same thing the film does, which is like, okay, well, what happens if the founder of your company dies and you need to be employed for the next 20 years? And you need to like do your job. What does that job look like? In the end, this documentary, that's simplistic form more than the heady stuff or the symphonic stuff or the music. It is just a bunch of people doing their job. Their job just got really hard and really weird. In the same way, you know, nobody's in I doubt there's anybody in a board meeting say let's make fans mad or let's destroy what Epcot is, but it is so big and so distinctly not something that you can just put any random thing in. It is not a Hollywood Studios, which is perfect for I mean, that park Disney MGM went through just as big of an abandonment of intention
Yeah.
than Epcot did. It just didn't feel as big of a betrayal because movies. And that's all you basically need to say. Because if the idea that it's like a behind the scenes park, that is completely gone. It is now just Toy Story and Galaxy's Edge, and there's barely anything that even references the making of a film. But at the same time, movies is a good enough catch-all, so they built it and then they just got lucky there. I think you're right with Epcot Center. You do kind of get unlucky where you can't just retheme it because it's huge, and you can't, you have to do it one at a time. We can't go back to Exxon and ask them to make another oil film, because not only did that not really work that well the first time, but because the idea of that is so far gone. I mean, even, and that was a big thing that the documentary I wanted to show was, even when this place opened, this was like the last push of this corporate. It's mentioned at least once or twice, I think, in one of the in the laser sequence. It's like, people don't trust institutions and government anymore, in the same way they did in the 50s and 60s when kind of those original Tomorrowland sponsorships were being done. And it's like, if this barely passed and was still criticized heavily in 82, I don't know how you would even begin to try to do it today in any similar way. It's a very, does that make sense?
Oh yeah.
It's a very, I don't know, like you can't make Universe of Energy, because not only would you not want to, but because how would you go about making, asking an oil company, hey, tell us what you think the future is? That's not going to work. It didn't work in 82 for most people. Stuff like that,
Yeah.
And I think people think that and I understand all the takes, because I think that futurism as a concept is something that, and then that's kind of what season 3 is about, is kind of the death of futurism. And something that I like talking about is just this idea of like futurism as a concept. If you just boil it down to just what it is, which is the belief that you can make a better future, is great. That's an amazing idea. The belief that you can do something, that tomorrow is going to be better than today, that we can work to achieve something. But futurism as a aesthetic that is unchanging is, for some people, they really like it. They like the sounds, they like the synth, they like the silver, they like the chrome. But that idea that existed, the Jetsons, the Epcot, the silver chrome future, in practice, not only is it extremely limiting, not only is it from one perspective, but it's just not sustainable to the changing of ideas, to the changing, what I mean?
Oh
And so
yeah.
Epcot Center existing as even Epcot, and what the film shows is like this future that opened, this silver reflective chrome future. Like, they came up with that like a year before they built it. While they were building it, it was originally going to be gold, which is not what is imprinted in most people's mind when they think of, what does futurism look like, at least in the common narrative sense.
Yeah, I think that comes across just how, how things that seem like they were the grand plan of Epcot Center, actually a lot of it, I mean, they were scrambling to get that park open. I mean, there was dirt everywhere a few months before it opened, so they had to make a lot of decisions on the
Yeah.
fly. And it's kind of amazing it came out as well as it did in a way that they got it. They did it that way.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say, and this complicatedness is what I wanted the film to be. I wanted it to feel inspired, and I think there was one or two comments on YouTube that I was like, oh, thank gosh, some people got it. It made me happy. Just that it is complicated. You're not supposed to feel one way about it because EPCOT Center, the music, the attractions, the intention, the ideal, or even just if you want to be more cynical about it, the rhetoric, the copy, the what it is, the pitch. It can sweep you away in this, wow, communication. It is incredible. And then you get off of that ride and now you're at the Exxon ride or you're at the General Motors ride and now you have more complicated feelings about this entire conceit and what was hard to do was not come out and just say, as me, the narrator, make a snarky remark, say something about this, say something about that. It was just, yeah, I want you to feel that complicatedness. I do want you to see this weird corporate product that was a series of compromises and spins, and how do we take this idea and make it into something we can actually do, and how do we do this, and how do we get this company to give us $30 million and all these things. But also to see, like, it was just a bunch of people on the ground doing their job. And while they were doing it, they did some incredible things. And how you grapple with that in your own mind, I think is going to depend on what you come into it with. If you come into it as, I love Epcot, Epcot's the best, then I think the film, I think that people will like the documentary. But if you come into it thinking, man, Epcot's weird, I think, and I just, why is it weird? I think the documentary answers that as well. It's definitely a more abstract idea of and less literal. And that's been it was a challenge to put this out there and to hope that people could to interpret it, because it's interpretable and it supports multiple readings. But I think in general, what I wanted the documentary to do was, it was not to dispel. It was not to say EPCOT Center is terrible or EPCOT Center is perfect or the best or even good. It is just, look at these giant dominoes that just hit each other, not just in terms of the company or the Imagineers or the executives, but the fact that at the same time this is happening, the computer's coming out and that disco music is happening and that folk music is taking off in this, and all these things, and that the rise of this, the fall of this, the corporations, all, it's just this, like I said at the beginning, it's just this big whirlwind. And just hope that that it allows people to just kind of experience it and just sit in that kind of tornado of influences and see, and at the very least, regardless of what it says about the product, just that you come out of it and say, I understand exactly why EPCOT Center is the way that it is when it opened, and then you can kind of complete the arc yourself by seeing the changes that have been made.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to sum up what you're getting at in the film and what I enjoyed so much about it. Because sure, I would love to just praiseworthy, like you mentioned, to show what was great about it. But I think you ended up delving into something so much more complicated, but also more interesting, that I think even stood out to me more the second time I watched it, when I, the first time I was just kind of along for the ride, but the second time you're able to think more about it. Now, after talking with you, it's even more that way, Kevin. So you finished this and you've heard back from people and everything else. It sounds weird to say this. You just spent 4 years on this, but I'm curious what you're thinking of doing next, either for Defunctland or something else you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of stuff that I want to do. I think my biggest thing is I'm obviously going to go back to doing narrated videos. I think one of the biggest things people said, which very flattering, is that they miss my voice, which I never thought I would hear. I always thought, man, if I could just make these without me talking, then people would really like them. But apparently people like hearing me talk, which is very kind. So I don't want to put that down. But I think in general, while I created this one, the one about Epcot, I was also working on Disney Channel and FastPass, which also did really well. So I think, kind of trying to replicate that track as best I can. I want to put something into production that I can dedicate 3 years to. Something weird. This was a huge risk creatively, and something that I can, put a bunch of my craft into, more animation, stuff like that, stuff that I really am personally passionate about, and then also create stuff that the easy watching stuff that's less less risky, but still of value, hopefully. And I think with that is the next big project. I think I'm going to try to the next big project. I really want to venture outside of one of the major corporations rather than Disney and Universal. Do something more regional, more specific, and definitely in the case of being able to be a little bit more creative with the use of stuff. See what I can create, and then maybe while I'm doing that, I really have some other ideas that I want to do about, like I'm working on a Deal or No Deal video right now that I've been working on for a while, which I know is very weird to after watching my
cool.
EPCOT video. Check out the Deal or No Deal. It's a perfect sequel. But then I also, there's other stuff. I really want to talk about some of the EPCOT attractions. I want to do some Hollywood studio stuff. Recently, I've been really engaged with the dark age of Hollywood studios and all the weirdness that was there. I think the thing about that interests me the most is stuff that hasn't been talked about as much, or stuff that is just bizarre. I think that's it. I think that there's always going to be a certain reverence and fascination with anything that I do, as well as a fair amount of criticalness and snark. But it is just that I really like stuff. I really like pop culture that's just weird and doesn't perfectly make sense, So stuff like that.
Well, I think that's great. And definitely on your channel, there's much more than just Disney focused. I've enjoyed a lot of the TV videos.
Yes, and more Defunct TV.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. Beyond, EPCOT is right in my wheelhouse, but there's tons more to watch. So if anyone has come this far in the show and doesn't know where your work is or where to connect with you, I just want to give you a minute to tell where you are, because I think people, if they've come this far, will know it, but just to be safe.
Yes, you can go to youtube.com/Defunctland, or just Google Defunctland, and you should be able to find it. At YouTube, you'll find all of the links to all the other stuff, to our various social media stuff. But that's where all the major releases go. youtube.com/Defunctland.
Well, awesome, Kevin. This has been a real treat for me. Love the documentary. Love some of the other ones. Fast Pass was incredible. Thank you so much for talking with me on the podcast. This was awesome.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and ramble about this one.
No rambling at all. Totally
don't. You're too kind.
Just wanted to give a big thanks to Kevin for this interview, and to Ellie at Defunctland for helping to set up everything. It was a real treat for me. If you enjoyed this interview, there are so many other cool conversations with experts on theme parks, former Disney Imagineers, podcasters, filmmakers like Kevin. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/podcast to learn more, or you can just check out all the archives. Every episode is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to shows. If you would like to support this show, there is a great way to do so through Patreon. And you can receive access to some really cool perks, including a lot of bonus podcasts. Go to patreon.com/tomorrowsociety to learn more. I always love hearing from you, and I would love to hear from you about this episode. Email me, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, and you can follow the show at basically every social media platform at Tomorrow Society, and check out the Tomorrow Society YouTube channel. The music you are hearing right now was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. I'm just going to close by saying that I hope you have a great holiday and you enjoy the rest of the year. This is the final episode of this year on the Tomorrow Society podcast, but I will be back in early 2024 with a bunch of shows, hoping to come flying out of the gates with, at least in the beginning, several weeks straight, if not longer, of episodes, trying to plan ahead and really make 2024 the best year yet on this podcast and just in general. I hope you're all doing great out there. Thank you so much for listening to this episode with Kevin Perjurer. And if you do like this episode, please spread the word about the show. It makes a big difference, and it's really cool for me to hear that you're out there enjoying it and letting other people know, because I love doing this podcast, and especially the chance to talk to just really cool, interesting people like Kevin and so many others during the past year. Thank you so much, as always, for listening, and I will talk to you again in 2024.